Hello, A-level psychology students. Welcome to the final new piece of information you will ever learn about psychology, unless, of course, you are planning to study it at university, and why wouldn't you as well? It's a fascinating subject. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the ethical issues, and there's a couple of key terms we're going to consider. So if we have a look here at the specification, you can see it's the ethical implications of research, studies and theories, including reference to social sensitivity. So there's 4 different things you need to know there. You need to know what ethical implications, what that term means. You need to know research studies that have ethical implications. You need to know theories with ethical implications, or a theory at least. And then you need to know, be able to make reference to why they're socially sensitive. So we'll have a look at each one of those as well. Okay, so there's a couple of the different types of questions if you just want to have a look, and we'll go through this one later on. Some other ethical implications, these ethical questions, these are ones from earlier specifications, but definitely still ones that could come up with a particular focus on Milgram, unsurprisingly. Okay, so ethical implications is the impact the research might have upon both participants within the research themselves, so that's where you need to consider things like informed consent, right to withdraw and so on, and then wider society as well. So there might not be any impact to the participants within the research themselves, however the way it's used within the wider society, it might have significant impact on them. And we'll have, so for example, we've got here Bowlby's theory, which suggests that children might be affectionate psychopaths if their mothers went to work or their mothers didn't provide the care and love that they needed. So obviously that's got clear implications for any working mothers, and sort of if they want to work and how they're viewed because of that. So that would be an ethical implication that they wouldn't have been necessarily been participants within Bowlby's study, but it was the wider society. So not only do you need to consider protecting your participants, but you also need to consider the wider society. What is the implication of your research beyond the confines of where it's studied? And then social sensitivity. So these are any topics. So socially sensitive research are any topics which are controversial and could have ethical implications. So those 2 terms are quite closely linked. Ethical implications are the impact the research has, and socially sensitive research is research that could have ethical implications. And then there's tons of examples, and there's loads of examples in both The Green-Haired Girl and the Dog Book, for example, race and IQ, or gender and IQ, homosexuality. Any of those things potentially could be incredibly socially sensitive. They could have severe ethical implications if the research found certain things which was then used in inappropriate ways. And there are some more examples of socially sensitive research that you can have a read of. They're not ones we cover on the spec, although RAIN is a very common one within Edexcel and OCR as well. So just some interesting ones to have a look at and consider what ethical implications they might have, so what impact they might have, so therefore you would have identified why they would be socially sensitive. And then there's some examples from the spec or from the book as well, because BERT isn't on the spec, but it is something that you can look at. So you've got Milgram and the idea that technically there were some ethical implications within the study themselves. They talk about the idea of, I think one of the participants had a seizure, and lots of people said it was a really horrendous experience that they had to go through, but I think the majority of them at the end said that they would be happy to take part in it again. So there's no immediate ethical implications necessarily, although there was deception. Right to withdraw was removed, and protection from harm, although ultimately there was no negative impact on the participants. But then obviously there are wider ethical implications. So could you turn it on its head and suggest that the way that the research from Milgram's, or the findings from Milgram's research, would be able to encourage people to do things they didn't want to do? So could we increase obedience for acts that were inappropriate and weren't ones that people would want to take part in? And then again, we've talked about Bowlby with the affectionless psychopath, so the idea that that's ethical impact. So there wasn't necessarily any ethical impact from the research that he conducted immediately on the participants. However, wider research for that suggested that there was some very negative impacts on mothers who'd like to work. And then if you have a look at Bert 11 Plus, he conducted some research which was actually fraudulent into the idea that if the intelligence that you displayed at the age of 11 would sort of indicate your permanent sort of intelligence levels, and then that had significant impact because of the 11 pluses were developed, so it decided which school you went into and ultimately kind of which education you experienced, which would quite clearly have an impact on your choices that you made. So if you have a look at that, that's in the Green Haired Girl book, I think, but obviously you've got both of them that you can access. So where might these ethical implications happen? Where might you need to consider them in the process, where they may arise? So they could arise when developing the research question. Obviously you need to think quite carefully about the research question that you develop. That doesn't necessarily mean shy away from it, you just have to acknowledge that potentially ethical implications might arise from conducting research into race and IQ, gender and IQ, homosexuality, anything to do with people in the trans community, absolutely anything, criminals, anything you can think of at all. There's quite a lot of ethical implications from the research question. So don't necessarily avoid it, but just consider how what they might be. The treatment of participants, that's the traditional kind of ethical issues we discussed in AS, the idea that we have to protect our participants from harm, right to withdraw, informed consent, etc., etc. And then you need to think about the context. So how could your findings be misinterpreted or misreported? So this is a really key one when you think about institutions when they develop public policy, or so how would the government, how might they use them? And BERT's an excellent example of that, so I'd highly recommend you reading about BERT in the scan sheet that's going to be attached to the email that sends this link. And also how could it be misreported? So hopefully you're all very aware about how misleading the media can be. And Ben Goldacre, who I've probably mentioned before, is an excellent author who writes a lot about publication bias and media and how things are misrepresented. So you do need to, that's something else where ethical implications might happen. And then actual application, so how could they be misused? So context, how could they be misunderstood, misinterpreted and misreported? And then applications, practically, how could they be misused? How could the findings be used to, which would then have ethical implications? And actually BERT might sit more appropriately here. Milgram, as we've spoken about, you could use him to kind of encourage people to obey acts that weren't necessarily ones they choose to at other points. So that's where your ethical implications might happen. And then, of course, how can we reduce them? So really the only thing in place to encourage us to reduce the ethical impact of research is the ethical guidelines. And they protect the immediate participants within the study, which of course is important, but as we've discussed, isn't the only concern that you should have as researchers. And then guidelines, there are some suggested guidelines. Now these aren't as formalised as the British Psychological Guidelines. So British Psychological Guidelines will be some severe kind of, well, there'll be some sort of consequence, I'm sure, for breaking the ethical guidelines, such as not being allowed to continue to study as a psychologist, not being allowed to conduct research, whereas these are, the ones below are genuine guidelines, so kind of, as in they just give you guidance on what to consider, so things you should be mindful of as a researcher. They haven't been kind of formally put in place. So you need to think about, and the things they suggest that you think about there, could you accidentally support any discriminatory views? So again, that's probably sits around with your research question, the way you ask that. Could your research have any implications that might be ethical implications, so negative kind of impact on wider than just your participants? Again, uses in public policy, what is the research likely to be used for? So you need to consider that carefully, because of course you talk about BERT and Bowlby. So Bowlby was used at the time around the end of the Second World War, roughly, to encourage women to return to the role of carer, because before that in World War II, obviously with the men being away, they got used to being able to work and to do jobs that previously would only be considered ones that men could do. And then Bowlby was used as a way of drawing them back into the home, suggesting that if they weren't around, that your children would become affectionless psychopaths. And then the validity of the research. Is the research being affected by your own bias? Even if you didn't realise, are you conducting some research expecting to find one thing and your bias is influencing it? And also, do you need to be reflexive? So we talked about reflexivity and the idea that you need to consider your own biases, and are they having an impact on the research? And that's a term that I think might have passed a few of you by, but it's a really important one to consider. So it's kind of using the bias in quite a useful way, acknowledging that it exists, and kind of considering it. So we talked about that in gender bias, and the idea that a lot of women who conducted research into the discriminatory experiences of women, need to acknowledge that that is the case, something that they're probably biased towards finding certain things or expecting certain things to happen, and it's really important that they acknowledge those bias rather than just pretend that they don't exist, which of course will increase the validity of the research. And then evaluation. So evaluation is a bit of a tricky one for ethical issues, but there's a couple of different things that you could talk about. So a strength of socially sensitive research is that it can be extremely beneficial and very important to have. And just be careful with these, listen to them carefully, because if you only put strength above the first one, you need to consider the others and decide whether they're strengths or weaknesses as well. So there's a research in the Green Hair Girl or the Cat book, sorry, I can't remember which one now, the dog book, who suggests that researching discriminated against and underrepresented groups can be extremely beneficial. So of course, if you choose not to do any socially sensitive research and you ignore a group because you think, oh, that research might have negative impact on them, well, of course, it's sort of contributing to that idea, because if you don't continue to be researched, then they continue to be marginalised, and that won't help the situation. So it's really, really important to kind of not shy away from that research, but continue to conduct research to kind of bring people, to represent people that perhaps aren't always represented. As you know, there's a certain type of person who's more likely to be selected as a sample than anyone else. Can't remember the exact figures now, but white male student from America is the key person. And of course, other things like socially sensitive research, you know all about eyewitness testimony without having conducted that socially sensitive research. And Loftus, she recently, sort of within the last year, was interviewed for a newspaper talking about bullies and not letting people kind of put her off her goal, because because of the way her research was developed, she received a lot of negative press, a lot of death threats, and quite serious things, because she was researching false memory syndrome and eyewitness testimony. And of course, you now know how beneficial that is. It allows juries to make more informed decisions, knowing that eyewitness testimony isn't reliable, and also develop cognitive interviews as well, reduce leading questions, so it stops miscarriages of justice. If you have a look on the Innocence Project, there's a figure that's how many people previously that have been, because DNA was brought in, how many people were released from jail, so they'd been sentenced because of misleading eyewitness testimony. So it's a really significant thing, being able to improve it. Social control, so you need to be really, really careful with socially sensitive research. It can be used really negatively as a form of social control. So there's used to be compulsory sterilisation for various people, and that links in with the idea of Goddard. So I won't go into that in more detail, but I'd really encourage you to read about that in both the cat book, the dog book, and the Green Haired Girl book, to be more aware of that one. Another problem is that there's issues with the guidelines. So there are guidelines in place to protect participants which work fairly effectively, but there's a lot of research that suggests they don't go far enough, as they don't require you to consider beyond your immediate participants, so they don't actually really get you to consider the wider ethical implications, such as all the research that we've just looked at, what kind of impact does that have. And then also ethical committees are very, very subjective, so we conduct cost-benefit analysis to decide whether does the cost outweigh the benefits, or vice versa, and should that research go ahead. There might be a little bit of deception, but is it that serious, or there's very, very significant deception? Well, that's just a group of people talking about it and making their own decisions. So of course, quite clearly it's subjective. What one person considers too much deception, the other person might not, or one person considers too much harm, the other person might not agree with either. So the guidelines, although there's some there, are they sort of robust enough to deal with all the different ethical implications? Should they be expanded and considered? And then the conclusion, which is something we haven't necessarily done before, but in this normally you would perhaps put it in place of the interactionist approach, because this one is about how to move forward in the future. So for nature versus nurture, consider the combined approach. Consider it's not nature or nurture, but it's how much does each impact it, and that's how we can move forward. The same with the nomothetic and the ideographic. You don't take one approach or the other, you cover all bases by considering both. Free will versus determinism, etc., etc., etc. So this is a conclusion, sort of moving forward. What should ethical guidelines consider, or psychologists who are considering conducting research with ethical implications? It's all about taking responsibility for their own research. So that means thinking, so again, kind of reflecting back on those things we've already discussed. So considering how could how could that piece of research be misabused, misinterpreted, misreported, and can we work with the people who should try and report them? So Ben Goldacre is a really good example of somebody who works quite closely with the press, and himself is a journalist as well as a GP and a researcher who works hard to report research. So moving slightly away from psychology, but for example, teaching people to understand and avoid misleading headlines about this week this causes cancer, and next week it'll be something else. It's taking control of how your research is shared. And the British Psychological Society is mentioned in the CAT book. They do this because they have a department which works with the press and encourages or ensures accurate reporting of any psychological research, although how effective it is remains to be seen. And therefore, so taking responsibility of that research, working with people who report the research or use the research, so it could be the governments as well, so you could consult with those. It will allow you to have more control and hopefully encourage more responsible usage. So socially sensitive research can still be conducted, the research can still be used effectively, and it can avoid that kind of biased or over sensationalized reporting or misuse of the research. Okay, and then this example here, just to give you a quick idea about how you might how you'd break it down and consider too. It says briefly explain how the researcher could have dealt with the issue of social sensitivity in this study. Well, as it says in this study, you know it's AO2, so you must make reference back to the stimulus, but there's two ways of talking about it. So one side of it would be being aware of the issue, which is what we've spoken about. So kind of the wider ethical implications, so consider what the impact might be on other people within that their target population, within the school, etc, etc, etc. And then the one below that is dealing with the issues, so directly working with the participants themselves to kind of consider the ethical issues. So they're being debriefed, have they, because they're 14, have they given informed consent, or have they ensured that the appropriate people have given informed consent for them, confidentiality, all of those things. So if a question was asked like that, there would be two ways that you could approach it, or you could approach it in both, split down the middle, 2 marks for one and 2 marks for the other. So researchers need to consider the wider ethical implications, being aware of the issues that it might raise, but they also need to ensure that the participants themselves are protected. And then it's direct examples from or quotes from the specification or the stimulus itself. Okay, and that is the end of all of the issues and debates and everything that we have to cover for year 2. So from now on, it's revision, revision, revision.